This is a panel where it's called Learning from the Past, and it's really going to build on the experience of three people who have played three very different but very important roles in dealing with some of the big issues that the big policy issues that face any government, frankly, at any time. And that experience, I think, is going to be very, very interesting. We'll discuss what's worked and what hasn't in past economic challenges, and use some of that learning to determine, what is it that we haven't been able to do in terms of productivity. We'll talk about the fact that we have been talking about this for decades. Lots of good solutions have come up, lots of good proposals, but somehow we haven't been able to implement them. And I think I mentioned this in my remarks this morning. One of the hopes we have for this summit is to really move beyond talking, and we'll have lots of great solutions and great ideas. Not worth much if we don't figure out what have been the barriers to actually implementing some of those solutions. So that's going to be a focus of this panel. We're really going to let them just have at it. I'll probably prompt with a question or two. I don't think we'll have time for questions from the audience. This really is an opportunity to listen to three people who have an incredible amount to contribute to this discussion. John Manley is chair of Jefferies Securities, but he is former deputy prime minister, former finance minister, former industry minister, former lots of things. Did you ever just get called minister of everything? I think you did. Yes, he says, with, humility. And he served in Parliament from 1988 to 2004. Key, for those of you who would not have known this, but John Manley was a key part of the government. So at the end of the Mulroney era and the beginning of the Chrétien era, there was a moment there where the entire country understood that we had a very significant debt problem and significant repeated problem of deficits. And John was instrumental in helping the country turn that around. So that perspective is going to be really valuable. Serge Dupont is a senior advisor and head of public policy at Bennett Jones, but he was deputy clerk of the Privy Council, supporting the Prime Minister and Cabinet. He also had lots of different roles in the civil service, and I'm not even sure how many deputy minister roles that you ended up having, but also tremendous experience to be able to contribute to this discussion. And then we have Dwight Duncan, who's a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. We'll have to, work on getting you to do double duty, right? But former deputy premier and minister of finance in Ontario. So he has very similar experience to John's in the sense of coming from the political side. How do some of these things get resolved? And from a productivity perspective, how come we haven't solved this one yet? And in fact, it's only gotten worse. So I will invite all three of them to come up. And as I said, I'll just kind of throw that one question, but really, I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. So I sort of already asked the question, but I'm going to ask it again. From your perspectives and your experience, living through some times in our country where we actually had big challenges and we got them, we actually dealt with them. And of course, lots of opportunities, lots of situations where we've had big challenges and haven't been so good at dealing with them. Productivity being obviously the issue of the moment. I'll start with John just because you're closest to me, but how come? How come we haven't been able to figure this out? What are the barriers to getting solutions? And do you see an opportunity now?
Well, can I start the way you kind of started with the introduction and talk about when we had a really big issue and we did manage to deal with it. And it wasn't intuitive or necessarily popular at the time. And that is that we, when we confronted the deficit in the early 90s. And I would say, if Prime Minister Chrétien were here, he would talk about the three things that he is most proud of in his government, one of which was not going to war in Iraq, another of which was the Clarity Bill, but the big thing is that he brought the deficit from a crushing level, much higher than it is today relative to the economy, to a balanced budget in about 4.5 years. And how did that happen? And how did we achieve it? Well, first of all, credit where credit is due. The public was already beginning to be conditioned to the fact that there was a problem. This took political leadership. There's no other way to put it. This wasn't sermons in churches. This wasn't university symposia. This was political leadership. The government of the day, the Mulroney government, had some very well-noted television advertising where you saw a loonie with a big chunk taken out of it. And that chunk was about 36% of the loonie. And the message was 36 cents out of every dollar that you pay in tax goes just to pay the interest on the debt. That began to sink in to people. I have to say that the Mulroney government talked about that, but they didn't actually ever lower it. It curved down a little bit and then was going back up again. We took over with a deficit in the order of 6.5% of GDP. The debt to GDP ratio was over 65, was closing in at 70%. And a few things happened. First, there was a peso crisis in Mexico, and that caused everyone to pay attention. NAFTA was newly in effect. And then the Wall Street Journal, God bless them, published an editorial in which they titled it "Bankrupt Canada?" and talked about us being an honorary member of the third world. Now, politicians from Canada can tell Canadians lots of things and they ignore it, but when the Wall Street Journal speaks, by gosh, they listened. And so those were the conditions. My colleague Paul Martin was Minister of Finance. He went before the Finance Committee of the House of Commons and said that come hell or high water, was the quote, we were going to bring the deficit down. Now, our target was 3% of GDP, but once we applied the formula, it went well beyond that. Now, just so that you understand how hard this was, because we've talked about doing a lot of things here today that were hard, that could be hard to do. We cut everything. We cut everything. There was one exception among departments, and that was what was then known as the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. Largely, I have to say at that time, it was a social welfare department, and so there wasn't really much you could cut without causing people to starve on reserves. But every other department was cut. I was the industry minister. I lost 1/2 of my budget. I lost 25% of my employees in one budget. We had 54 programs in the Department of Industry. Some of those acronyms, I gathered from Andrew earlier today, have returned. We had 54 programs. After the cuts, we had 9. We didn't dial them down like a rheostat. We just cut them. And the people that administered them left. And it was a new day. My colleague who is here, Anne McClellan, lost a little bit more of her budget at Natural Resources than I lost of mine. Every department had cuts, not all at that level. I think Anne's was the highest and mine was next. But every department faced cuts. Transfers to provinces were cut. And you know what? Despite that, the provinces kept going, and several of the premiers said, of course you had to cut us. And it sent a whole signal down through the system that it was time to get our house in order, and Canadians bought into it. My gosh, they re-elected our government after 3 years of that, and shortly after that re-election, we balanced the budget, balanced it, and that preceded 11 more years of balanced budgets in Canada that only ended with the great global financial crisis in 2008. And one of the reasons Canada emerged from that crisis relatively unscathed was because we had spent 12 years paying down debt, reducing service charges, living within our means. It was, Dwight may bear witness to this, at that time in Canada, if you talked about a deficit, you were not going to get elected because the public had become deficit hawks. I think the Deficit Hawk Convention that I chair annually in Ottawa, I'm the only one that really attends it, is one of the most sparsely attended events that we have on the political agenda in Canada these days. But curmudgeons of the world unite.
I heard a rumor that there was somebody from the Wall Street Journal, either here or watching live stream, and this is of course being live streamed. So maybe, just maybe, the Wall Street Journal could talk about the serious productivity problem in Canada, if that had that much of effect on people's, if there was that reaction. I just also want to note one thing that John just said that is worth really remembering. They took some really, really tough steps. A lot of people suffered, a lot of people lost jobs, and they got reelected. That's something I want us to talk a little bit more. What got the public to be supportive of tough decisions? I'm not sure we're there yet for this particular issue, but I think we need to, but I think that's part of the discussion. And then Dwight, you mentioned just before coming up that there was consensus. So,
yeah, there had been a political consensus in Canada on deficit reduction. I mean, at the end of the Mulroney era, the Mulroney coalition blew up. You had the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, you had the Reform Party here. I think looking back, people like Preston Manning deserve some credit in moving on that file. And I guess the point I would like to make is we need to develop that kind of consensus on productivity. It, in my view, is on that order of magnitude. Just as it was back in the 1980s on free trade. A little different, happened, before the opposition parties were in accord with it, but it happened. And the 1988 election confirmed it and gave the second Mulroney government the mandate to proceed. I've listened carefully this morning. I must say, some of it was quite depressing. But I think there's a lot to be excited about. I think we need somebody, I think it may have been Andrew mentioned the McDonald Commission. We may need something like that on productivity. If a government can do one big thing in a mandate, that's about all they're going to do. Think of Brian Mulroney. You think free trade, you think GST, the Chrétien government, deficit elimination, getting the country's books back in order, movement on some other issues, a lot of movement in the Mulroney government on some other issues. But it has to begin by building a consensus. And I think that's where we missed the boat. And I think if we start something modest like that, and this isn't going to happen overnight. I think Andrew said, incremental steps now, building and building and building, and with the magic of compounding, are going to add up over time. And this will take time, in my view. I think many of the speakers I've heard today underestimate the political challenges with any of the things they talked about. I think you were coming back to that in your last comment with John, that you can do tough things and get reelected. Yes, you can. We harmonized the sales tax in Ontario. We cut corporate taxes. My friends in Alberta probably don't realize this, but Ontario had a lower tax base for 3 years than Alberta did on the corporate side. We're liberals from Ontario. We don't like to brag about those things. I would simply say that if you can build a consensus and take small bites, and this has to go over more than one government, and that's why I think, in my view, hopefully a leader will emerge somewhere in this country who can lead that and keep it together the way the Chrétien government did on deficit reduction, the way the Mulroney government did on free trade, the GST, I think we'll all be better off if that happens.
So obviously, as a former bureaucrat, never had to be elected or re-elected, so it gives me some freedom of perhaps of thought in some cases. One way to think about this is we're frustrating because we've been talking about this for 25 years and what has not happened. And I just want to reflect a bit on that period of time. So when we kind of looked at the data with David Dodge and colleagues at Bennett Jones, we see there's a bit of a break around 2006. I won't go deep into the data here, don't worry, we talked a lot about that this morning. But 2006 is when you see a break in the trend in terms of GDP per capita and productivity. Well, what's happened since then? Well, 2008, global financial crisis, right? In the global financial crisis, we were kind of felt pretty good about the fact that, our banks kind of held well. But we still felt the aftershocks, through our manufacturing sector, obviously. And what you see is that global trade, as a proportion of global output, basically then started stagnating, 2008. So we had trade pull an economy like Canada's for a number of years, and then all of a sudden, this was kind of basically now stagnating. So that's 2008. Then 2014, obviously, collapse of oil prices, and our energy investment goes down and never fully recovered to where it was at that time, right? And then, of course, it was further slowed down by regulatory and political kind of obstacles, Paris Agreement, everything else, how that is all figured out. You go to 2018, perhaps a bit less shocking, but that is where President Trump starts applying tariffs on China. And then at the end of 2018, we get stuck with the Meng Wanzhou thing, get stuck, or we stick ourselves into it, whichever want to see it. But anyway, that happens, the two Michaels and so forth. Now all of a sudden, the relationship with China is upended. Okay. 2020, COVID. 2021 is, then we get into 2020, I guess, the war, the Ukraine war, and the IRA is another kind of major aspect of policy that's shifted our environment. And so through this, we've been going through a series of shocks, and in many cases, just trying to keep our head above water, and not having found our way through it. If you look again at the data, and Tim Sargent has a document that he circulated in advance, or the school circulated in advance of this, you see on a chart that the United States, which is a bit of an outlier, because we're kind of, the Europeans are better than us, but not that much better. And the UK is perhaps, either worse or not better at all. But you see the US coming out of the global financial crisis after a big dip and coming out of COVID, they actually have a burst of investment and a burst of productivity enhancement. And we just kind of go back to where we were before and not quite. And so part of the lesson here is this thinking about, okay, it's not just necessarily the ability to implement the solutions that would have been there 20 years ago to the problems of 20 years ago, is have we been able to pivot and to rethink, what are the solutions to the problems of the global economy as it is today? And that's not just a public sector thing, it's a private sector thing. Of course, the two kind of working together at some point in time. And Mario Draghi and the EU just presented a report, like it's a really thick kind of report, basically trying to address this productivity challenge for the EU, right? One of the things he observes is that in the EU, there is no company with a market cap of more than 100 billion euros that wasn't there 50 years ago. In the US, the 6 companies with a market cap greater than $1 trillion weren't there 50 years ago. And so, maybe part of this is how dynamic we can be, how responsive we can be, how we can, pivot, basically, and address the world as it is today. And that's both a business proposition and a policy proposition.
So one of the things I think I've learned in my checkered career, and by the way, I've been in business now longer than I was in politics, just for the record.
So now is it more checkered or less? Sorry.
Well, both parts were checkered in one way or another, but I won't go into that right now. That's for the explosive documentary that we're planning for someday after I'm dead. Anyway, one of the things that I especially learned in my business career is that capital isn't just scared, capital is paranoid. And it's simplistic to say capital flows where it can earn or its reward. Yeah, but capital is very cautious as well. And I think no matter how, you know, which of the various formulae we listened to in the last few hours, the importance of investment has been key. You know, investment, people, technology, all combined. Investment is key. Investment only flows where it feels it's welcome and that the rules will be consistently applied, that they don't have to worry about their investment becoming stranded when there's a change in government and the policy flips upside down. We have not, in my humble opinion, been very good at that. I'll give you what I mean in maybe slightly different context. And Andrew talked about industrial policy. Well, I was industry minister 7 years. Well, you worked for me at Industry Canada, sir. I didn't want anyone using the expression industrial policy. I believed that that expression implied that bureaucrats and politicians knew better than markets how to allocate capital, and I didn't believe that that was true. Now, we were in a world in which we had not only NAFTA, we had the WTO agreement recently concluded. We lived in a world of globalization, trade barriers falling, and Canada could benefit as a small open economy in that environment. But I thought what we needed to do was get our framework right. Let's make sure we get our tax structure right. Let's make sure we get our regulatory environment right. Let's make sure that we get our competition law right. These are the pieces that we can do. Picking winners and losers, we're not so good at, and especially we're not good at getting rid of the losers after we pick them. We keep feeding them. And so we tried to shift away from that. But now we live in a different world. We live in a world where the Americans, the Europeans, others have an industrial policy. So what I would say is this. If you want to have an industrial policy, if that's what you've decided you want to do, it only works if you have a partnership between government and business. You've got to get everybody, and we're a small enough country that you can actually do this, get people into one room and understand what we each want to achieve, how we want to go about doing it. So that means you really can't be bad-mouthing your, name the sector. I'm close to some. Your telecom sector, raising your taxes on banks, beating up on your grocers. We need more foreign competition, like Costco and Walmart aren't foreign competition. We don't like, you know, who do we like? Who do we like? Well, we like small
You want to
business.
bring Andrew Coyne back?
We
here?
like small business, and we're hoping some of our big ones become small ones. So my thesis, Martha, is if we're going to get the kind of investment we need to make headway on this productivity issue, we're going to need to do it with an enlightened view from government that sees business and industry as a partner. Not that they can have whatever they want, because there is an important role for government to play to make sure that health, safety, environmental standards, labor standards are met. But there has to be a sense that investment is welcome and will be respected and will be celebrated and will not be denigrated and will not be taken away by usurious taxes.
So, yes. But I want you two guys to push him on this a little bit further, because all of that, we've been saying a lot of that kind of stuff for a long time. Why have we not done it? You said we need an enlightened government. I'm not sure government of 2 decades ago that really saw a problem, saw consensus, recognized the need to deal with this, with the deficit, the debt and deficits problem. how do we get to that place or a similar place on productivity? Because you can't just say, well, we'd love to have an enlightened government. I mean, that'd be awesome. But how do we get there? How do we actually get to the things that you've so well articulated need to be the case?
So I'm going to nuance John, and I'm going to call you on something you said in your comments with Andrew. I negotiated on behalf of Ontario the Chrysler and General Motors bailouts. There's a total of $14 billion invested. $4 billion of it was costs. The rest were loan guarantees, restructuring. It led to the largest IPO in the history of the world, I believe. I stand to be correct. Certainly the largest IPO in American markets. And it was not easy. Now, people at the time said, well, let them go into bankruptcy. Let it unfold the way it should. I sat across from the global CEO of Chrysler on a cold November afternoon and he said to me, we closed our St. Louis plant 6 months ago. And if Canada and Ontario are not at the table, we will take all of our production out of Canada and move it to the United States. Interestingly, I found out later that the American government's point of view on those two issues was divided. With Chrysler, they didn't see it as systemic. It's too small, too regional. General Motors was another matter. They felt it could plunge their entire economy further. And remember, this is after Bear Stearns, after the Lehman Brothers. And they came through on everything they agreed to do that we extracted from them. Fast forward to last year. The government of Canada and Ontario are making significant investments in EVs. Now, should we have just ignored that? Let me tell you, Michigan, Alabama, Georgia, Texas do both direct and indirect subsidies. They're not as transparent as we are. And the political challenge is, and by the way, that is still the largest contributor to gross domestic product in the largest province in the country. So governments are faced with tough decisions like that. I concur entirely with what John said. I used to sign off on all kinds of these programs as finance minister, and I remember thinking to myself, how do I really know? I mean, you have all the professional reports and so on saying if and but, right? But there is a role, in my view, and we cannot ignore the competition that's global. And, the free trade consensus has evaporated. There's going to be an election in 2 weeks in the United States, 3 weeks, I get 2 weeks. And I'm not sure either option is good from a trade perspective. But we cannot ignore what happens elsewhere. And if we do so at our peril. And if we miss an opportunity, and at the time, believe me, bailing out General Motors and Chrysler was the last thing anybody wanted to do. We had a rising deficit. We weren't certain at that point in time that global capital markets weren't going to fall apart. So.
Was that what you were going to take me to task? Or did you just finish taking John to task?
I took you to task in a nice way. I didn't agree with your comments about manufacturing.
There is a challenge, though, and we have a whole lot of economists. The numbers in terms of productivity in the automotive sector in Canada aren't that stellar. The numbers in terms of productivity in oil and gas are actually really good, relatively. And, somebody asked me today, well, yeah, but the GDP, the contribution of oil and gas to GDP has actually sort of flattened out over the last few years. And my answer to that is, who's going to invest in increasing production if you can't get it out of the country? right? There's a fundamental flaw here in governments choosing to support one sector and some might argue actively choosing not to support another sector. So that's another challenge from a governmental perspective. It's also, you know, we are a country of regions. But it does still remain a challenge, Dwight.
No question. I'm not disputing that. But we don't, in my view, you don't ignore an opportunity like the transition of a major sector that's going on globally and just allow those investments to go elsewhere. Make no mistake about it. Other countries are offering things, I think, every bit as large as we've done.
Yeah, I think that's what my concern was as well with Andrew's text. And I tried to pose a question downstairs in the breakout session on this because I felt like I'd just been in a first-year economics class, which I have been in a first-year economics class, and I loved it, you know, because I'm kind of a linear thinker. I was a math major, and first-year economics is great because you assume the markets work. You assume if you get all of the assumptions right, you've got a really good environment for an economy. And the trouble is, Canada is not able to do that in isolation. We live in this world where our next door neighbor has decided that they're going to put their foot on the scale, and we're just going to have to. Our feet aren't as heavy as theirs. I'm not speaking personally there, but we have to figure out how to be at least as smart. And one of those ways, Martha, and you allude to it, is we need to build on our strengths. So here's a factoid for the day, which I will give full credit to Stephen Polos for. He has estimated that when full, the Trans Mountain Pipeline will produce 0.5% of GDP for Canada. Now, think of the fact that it took us about, 12 years or so to build this thing. Thousands and thousands of people worked on it. During its construction, nothing was coming out the end of it. It's operated today by about 750 people. 750 people will produce 0.5% of Canada's GDP. Now, that's productivity. So if we, and by the way, that's a sector in a region, but that has national application. The taxes, the royalties, all of that flow into the national coffers are paying for all the things that we enjoy as signs of our prosperity. So if you can get 0.5% of GDP from 750 people, I'd say rinse and repeat.
You might have a few people in this town who would agree with you.
You can link productivity to traffic issues in the Greater Toronto Area. You can link productivity to I spent 6 years chairing the Gordie Howe Bridge. We're building the new border crossing between Windsor and Detroit. And it's allowing our goods and services. The average auto part can cross that border 29 times. And so our economies are that closely integrated, which is why those kinds of investments are important. The other thing, I was in the infrastructure session. I didn't want to say anything. I was listening carefully. From the first public study that John, your government, initiated with the George W. Bush study to the time the bridge opens next year, 25 years. So that's an issue, a real issue because product investments in infrastructure are crucial in my view to productivity improvements.
Just to build on that, to address productivity is going to require looking tax, regulation, so forth. We've talked a bit about that, although there's not necessarily a consensus over what that is, right? Nor as to what kind of industrial policy there could or should be. I just want to perhaps complicate it a bit at the risk of being, the unhelpful official. This has to happen while at the same time we build our greater national security and economic security, right? And for example, investing in national defense is not in and of itself inherently productivity enhancing, right? Depending on how you go about it. We also have to drive in one fashion or another at a pace that still has to be determined toward a lower carbon economy, right? And not all of that is going to be productivity enhancing. Capturing carbon in and of itself is not productivity enhancing. And third, we also have to do this while, to my mind, strengthening kind of social infrastructure and services. And one thinks of, housing, obviously, immigration, getting that right, education, healthcare for an aging population, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So, to my mind, what has to happen here, I was saying to John the other day, when I was working with him as Minister of Finance, and typically a budget was, you had an economic chapter, you had a social chapter, and then you had what we called a dumpster, which was where you treat everything else, and that sometimes at the time probably would have included, national defense or maybe the environment or whatnot. And the idea was, okay, your economic chapter is basically about giving you the resources to address your other issues. And you're going to be redistributing or, spending it in some way or another. I think we're going to have to work really, really hard now as in trying as best we can so that these other ventures I talked about, national security, lower carbon economy, social infrastructure, that also participates in a productivity agenda. So that productivity has to be the overlay for the budget, not just that one chapter. Because right now, that one chapter is not enough to pay for the other three, unless you actually are really smart about how you're going at the other three. And obviously here we're going to probably still treat it as a bit of a chapter, but a lot of the work over the next number of, next little while to make this work is going to be getting it right on the other three.
Hannah Thibodeau earlier today made the point, we have now, at least at the federal government level, a gender lens on every decision that gets looked at. Should we have a productivity lens? So instead of having it in, a part of a chapter, can we get overarching government decisions to think more broadly on how everything that we do should be with a lens of our improved prosperity, economic prosperity?
Yeah, let me just answer that quickly, and then John and Dwight can address it from their perspective. There's a risk to that in the sense that at some point, I've seen that, when we prepare cabinet documents or whatever, there's these headings that all have to be met, and it all becomes machine-like, and then you'll have, I was talking to somebody earlier, you'll have the Department of Veterans Affairs come in with their productivity-enhancing kind of initiatives, right? And so everything is going to be recrafted as productivity. So you have to be careful about that. But does a productivity lens have to apply across an agenda? Yes, I think that's right. You just have to be very deliberate about it and really take solid top-down leadership to make sure it's not just checking boxes here and there, but you're actually really meaning it as to how you're structuring and you're delivering the different parts of your agenda.
And there are always going to be conflicts between the productivity lens and whatever other lens, whether you're talking gender, whether it's Indigenous relations. I did something a couple of years ago. I read the Canadian government's plan on critical minerals, and right next to it I had the US government's plan. And suffice to say, from the way I read it, it's no wonder the Americans were able to become energy independent in 4 years. And the urgency they put to that, the trust in the private sector they put to that, I think that's lacking in Canada too. I think we need a lot more trust in the private sector. Still need to regulate. Read a great column in the Globe today about TD Bank in the US and what's going on. But there are, in my view, opportunities, and if you apply that productivity lens, and I think we should. I think that has to be central. There are going to be trade-offs, and they're going to be politically difficult.
And I think that's right. And I think that's where the onus of responsibility on leadership to communicate what we're trying to do is so important. Now, you know, I use the deficit example. We had the help of the Wall Street Journal. We had actually the example of New Zealand a few years earlier, who actually did need to go to the IMF for a bailout. And we were able to put all of the pain into a context. So I'm not sure, I'm not in the business anymore, but I'm not sure exactly what the analogy would be that Canadians would really understand. But I'd say the risk of Hannah's suggestion is that it's one lens, kind of what Serge is doing. It's one lens along with a bunch of other lenses. Whereas I kind of look at the whole thing as it's a train, and the locomotive is the economy. And in the cars behind the locomotive, we've got all of the things we want to do from a social point of view, from all of the myriad of things that governments are called upon to do. And if the engine isn't strong enough to pull all of that, then we're going to have to let a couple of cars off at the next siding, just drop them. And I think somehow we have to have the public understand that when we're, and probably it's right, productivity might be the wrong word, because it does have this connotation of, okay, you got to work harder, and maybe we do have to work harder. I'm trying to do my part, but we have to make sure the public understands that all of the great stuff that we do, whether it's gender equality, whether it's Indigenous relations and reconciliation, whether it's maintaining and improving our healthcare system, whether it's ensuring that we have the best schools that our children can go to, whether we do R&D in our university, that all depends on the engine. And the engine is part and parcel of productivity. It's not a separate piece. It's all there in that one box.
So I'm going to continue to push. How do we get there? So Dwight, you made a really an interesting comment about the need to have trust in the business community. And the United States is also federal. Obviously, it's quite different than ours, but there's a lot of politics involved in decision making in the United States. What is it? Can we learn some better practices? What is it that allowed the American governments involved to be able to say, we need to be energy independent, this is what we're going to do, and we need to trust business? What was the secret sauce? So we're trying to, we know we have a problem, we know the engine needs to keep running. I'm intrigued by that. Are we not learning lessons from others who are doing better than we are?
When Bob Ray wrote his first autobiography, so I'm sure there's going to be a second chapter, one of the key points he made was the things that he regretted was that he didn't build relationships with the business community. Whether you're talking about the oil and gas sector, the financial services sector, I find that the corporate leadership, and John, you're part of that, many people in this room are part of that, they're very sophisticated, very smart. They've done business in many cases around the world. They know what works, what doesn't work. And I say truly that too many Canadians don't trust business leadership. Now, I'll say one other thing. I heard a bit of labor bashing today in a couple of sessions. We could not have saved a number of businesses in Ontario had it not been for unions taking big concessions and then selling that to their membership. I could not convince the workers at General Motors and Chrysler to take a 30% cut in pay and benefits It had to be the leadership of the then CAW, now Unifor. It's not to say that we give them everything they want. It's not to say that there aren't issues. Somebody mentioned Ireland early this morning. I spent some time with the then finance minister, who went on to become Taoiseach. And I said to him, you know, there's, in Canada, a lot of people look to Ireland as being an example of, you know, how to do it right. And I said, you know, and the first thing people, and particularly in the business community, raise with me is taxes, tax levels, corporate tax levels. Then he looked at me and he said, you know, that's a part of it. He said, joining the European Union and embracing it the way the United Kingdom didn't do was a big help. Big. He said, in Ireland, for all those centuries when there was net migration out of the country until recently, every Irish young person who had capability could get a good education. And somebody else earlier this morning spoke of education. And that, I'll conclude by saying, that led me to one of the other problems I think any government's going to have to do, and that is, I believe there are some economic impediments. I believe there are some structural issues. For instance, we bring in free trade. The idea is, you know, there will be jobs for workers in these new industries. The workers leaving old industries will be retrained. We never retrain them. Governments of all political stripes, and I include my own, we tried a number of programs that met with very limited success. Same thing with venture capital. You know, we set up a venture capital fund, and within 2 years it was more cautious than the most conservative bank. So, and there have been other experiments, again, by other political parties that have, you know, had the same kinds of problems. So those are the sort of issues that I see kind of impediments to moving forward on a growth agenda, on a productivity agenda.
A couple of things to my mind that may help, you know, galvanize a bit more attention to this from a broader constituency. First, the fact, it's one thing to not grow as fast as other folks. It's another one to actually start declining. And, you know, I think that's when people really, I think, may start feel it a bit more. The other thing, we do compare ourselves to the US a lot. I'm not sure it's necessarily the comparison that a lot of Canadians necessarily embrace that well, because they think, oh yeah, but that comes with all kinds of baggage and whatnot. Although if you travel to US cities these days, it look a lot better than our cities. It seems to me pretty compelling right now that Keir Starmer in the UK, Labour minister, right, Labour Prime Minister, is basically talking about a burst of investment and putting all of the capital of his government behind now lifting private investment to, and public investment also, to strengthen the economy of the UK, which has, again, taken a turn not unsimilar to ours. EU, with Mario Draghi, this report and other reports, Mario Draghi is talking about raising the level of investment in the EU by 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP. He says it's the equivalent to 2 times the Marshall Plan, okay? So I think if we become aware that, okay, this is a problem that's not just Canada, it's around the world, right? At least in the parts of the world that are basically in proportional decline. You know, we don't necessarily want to be the odd person out not doing anything and just be complacent about the status of affairs. So I think drawing that out a bit, what's going on in the world, people are taking notice. Whether they'll have better solutions than we will, don't know. Time will tell. But to my mind, there is a bit of a turning point, and I think I wouldn't, John mentioned changing the word, I would actually use the word, because let's just use it, call it what it is, and it would be a first sign that we're growing up a bit.
Growing up, that's an interesting concept. That's, I like that. Let's just embrace it. We only have a few minutes left. I would like to ask, and I didn't warn you about this, but I'm still focused on, we have governments, we have a federal government now. We may have a new federal government in the not too distant future. We're here in Alberta. We heard from the Premier this morning. We have parts of this country that are struggling more than others, but they also have their own governments. In very as succinctly as you can, what would be your top advice, and to civil servants as well, Serge, like to the group of people who we have to rely on to make some of these decisions? What would be your advice to them, recognizing the political context, recognizing some of these are tough decisions? What would your short, quick, and incredibly savvy advice to governments, political and civil servant out there?
You're looking at me.
I'm looking at you.
Okay, I don't get to listen to them.
You're right next to me.
Yeah, okay. Well, this may surprise some people, but I'm kind of on the page that the Premier was this morning. I think if there's one thing we don't have a shortage of in Canada, it's government. No, I haven't heard that identified as a problem, shortage of government, in any of the sessions I've been to. So my advice to all of those governments would be stay in your lane. Stay in your lane. I think the Premier was right. There are things, and by the way, if we're going to use the word productivity with the public so they grow up, well, let's give them a little bit of a civics lesson too. Let's stop being federal politicians who claim to be able to do everything, down to fixing the parking problems in cities. Let's stay in our lane. Let's do what we have to do. The point is right. I know you asked me to be succinct, and here I go. But anyway, defense is not going to increase our productivity, defense spending. But you know what? We want to be a country, right? Like have a nation state. Nobody's inviting us to join the United States, so I guess we're kind of on our own. Well, that means we got to be able to defend it, and we all take pride in the Arctic. I'll tell you, if we properly looked after our own interests in the Arctic, we would meet the 2%, and we would become useful to Washington, one of the things that we need to achieve in order to have a trade relationship that continues to benefit us. So stay in your lane. Do the things that you're supposed to do. Work cooperatively. No Canadian likes to see the federal and provincial governments squabbling. Interprovincial trade, I tried that. I signed the first agreement, the internal trade agreement. You can look it up. It's in Wikipedia, 1994. It was a useless piece of paper, but we got it, and that wasn't easy to get, even though it was kind of a damp rag. The Supreme Court of Canada has made it clear. It is provincial responsibility. When poor Mr. Como couldn't bring his beer back to New Brunswick from Quebec, the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, it sucks to be you, because we're going to enforce that barrier. Provinces have to fix that. Let them get to work on it and stop pointing the finger at the feds on that one. Meanwhile, the feds have got to stay out of the way. So that's my advice. It's not very succinct, but also proves that I'm never going to get elected to federal office.
I'll just add a little bit to that. Get along. I got thrown into the deep end along with my late friend and colleague, Jim Flaherty, in 2008. And the two of us, we could mix it up like nobody could. I remember a Globe columnist, I think it was Murray Campbell, did a column once about two Irishmen outside a bar. And those two governments were able to work together and do a lot. Whether it was up until then, the largest infrastructure investment in Canadian history. And there was a lot of toing and froing and a lot of politics, but we stayed on the phone with one another. And we understood one another. And I must say, we were talking earlier this morning, I listened to the Premier of Alberta, and I thought, if you could take her and send her to Chambers of Commerce in small town Ontario, Ontarians would have a much better appreciation of the issues that Alberta faces and why fixing those issues is important to the entire country. I thought she was very eloquent. I thought she really spoke well on behalf of your province. And I've dealt with a number of Alberta premiers, finance ministers over the years, and you know, all similar. And I think there needs to be more of that. I would say get along. And I would say this productivity thing cuts across political lines, it cuts across linguistic lines, it cuts across provincial boundaries. And I think if we work together, this is still a darn good country to live in. And I'm optimistic, recognizing that it will take time. But I think if our governments can get along better. And by the way, I was one of the worst at throwing fuel on the fire in the old days. I guess that's one of the things as you get older, you get a little tamer about. But I really think that's in Canada's interest. And that's what's important.
So it'd be the first time I have the final word with politicians.
Now, that's just not true. The bureaucrats always get the final word, even if it's, yes, Minister, very courageous decision, Minister.
Actually, the story is a bold decision is one that will lose you votes. A courageous one is one that will lose you an election. Yeah. That was Sir Humphrey. My advice to a kind of a new government coming in would be have fewer press releases and announcements, so lesser programs, lesser stuff. Do more of the homework in advance of issuing your press release, and do more of the homework after you issue the press release in terms of implementing stuff and getting it done. There's been a lot of government by press release, and I think there's just got to be a bit more, you know, we're going into what you're doing and then actually pushing it through and getting it done. So that would be my piece of advice.
Here's hoping that whatever government we end up with in Ottawa and every other provincial government that we have has the three of you to give them advice. Please join me in thanking these guys. I think it's been fantastic.